Since World War II, the United States has had the largest and most powerful Navy in the world, or so we thought. But in 1985, when former Navy man John Walker and his ring of spies were arrested, the government was astonished to discover that the naval fleet had been systematically sabotaged for 18 years.
The most damaging thing they really did was to provide the Russians with real hard data on how good our submarines were.
Manned battle stations missile for PEM launch.
And enabled for a long period the Soviets to know exactly where all of our submarines were at any given time. If war had broken out, thousands and thousands of American kids would have died as a result of that.
John Walker Jr. began his espionage career in 1967 when he was a Navy radio man in Norfolk, Virginia, at the largest Navy base in the world. In his job, he had access to coded messages between the fleet's ships and submarines and the Navy Command Center. Most damaging, he had access to key lists used to decipher the Navy's top-secret encryption codes. 30-year-old Walker was in debt. He needed money and knew how to get it quickly, selling secrets to the Soviets.
The motivation was not complex, it was pure greed.
In late 1967, he traveled to Washington, D.C., walked into the Soviet embassy, and offered his services as a spy.
John Walker was a walk-in. He was one of those volunteers who came to the Russian embassy, Soviet embassy, in my time.
In 1967, Oleg Kalugin was then the KGB officer stationed at the Soviet embassy in Washington. He would supervise Walker's meetings with his KGB handlers.
Had the military conflict erupted between the two superpowers at the time, the compromised cryptographic material provided by John Walker would have had war-winning implications for the Soviet side.
Eventually, Walker provided the Soviets with the keys to the kingdom, compromising U.S. naval forces, including the strategic superiority of nuclear submarines, an incredible coup for the Soviets. Walker gave the Soviets daily code settings for the KL-47 encryption machine that encoded and decoded top-secret messages for the American fleet. Using the key lists provided by Walker, they could decipher the most highly classified communications of the U.S. Navy.
If we intercept the orders coming from Washington, even before the United States launches, we have an opportunity to make a preemptive strike, which would make America indeed in a very bad situation.
During that same time, the United States was waging a fierce war in Vietnam. The classified information Walker gave to the Soviets enabled them to pass along U.S. naval communications to the North Vietnamese.
They provided to the North Vietnamese the secret daily codes for our aviators as to where they would be going, which targets would get hit, what the rules of engagement were, so that it enabled the North Vietnamese to emplace their anti-aircraft weapons and to set up traps for the American aircraft. And as a result, a lot of airmen died because of that during the Vietnam War.
In 1976, after spying for 9 years, Walker retired from the Navy with the rank of Warrant Officer 3. Not the most prestigious rank in the Navy, but he knew the Soviets ranked him #1 as a spy. He started his own private investigation firm in Virginia Beach, but Walker wanted to keep his lucrative spy business going. So he enlisted the help of his brother, Arthur, and his friend, Jerry Whitworth, both Navy men with access to classified information. The same year, he divorced his wife, Barbara, who moved to Massachusetts with their 3 daughters. His son, Michael, chose to live with the father he idolized.
I had a closer relationship with my father. I was more like him. I wanted to be like him.
John Walker, flush with money, was leading the high life. He bought a plane and houseboat, partied heavily, and had lots of women.
I liked the way he dressed. I liked his cars. I liked his boats, his house, his women.
Well, we were more than just father and son. We were very good friends.
Walker was setting the stage for Michael to take over the lucrative spy business when he retired.
I was burning out at that point and looking to get out of it completely, just retire and quit.
He talked Michael into enlisting in the Navy and specializing in communications. Eventually, Michael was assigned to the USS Nimitz as a radio man, which fell right into his father's plans.
Joined the Navy like he had done. Did all the things in the Navy he had done, basically. And there was a pattern. Everything was pointing in that direction. There was no avoiding it. At a certain point, it was to the point of no return.
Amazingly, on board the Nimitz, Michael, without having security clearance, had no trouble getting access to and stealing hundreds of classified documents, which he dutifully handed over to his father. Michael hid the documents under his pillow and simply walked off the Nimitz with them in his duffel bag. He was never searched. Incredibly, Walker and his spy ring went undetected for 18 years, from 1967 to 1985. The Soviets had paid him close to $2 million. He was considered their #1 spy.
What a wonderful thing for a person who's having a rather mediocre career to be looking in the mirror each morning and saying, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most famous, the most dramatic, the most heroic spy of them all?" And to know that while your bosses think you're a mediocrity, you know you're the most important spy that the Soviets have ever recruited.
What finally brought Walker down? It wasn't naval intelligence. The Navy never suspected spies in their midst. The tip that led to Walker's arrest came from a much closer source: Walker's ex-wife. She had known about Walker's espionage and even accompanied him on some of his dead drops to the Soviets.
I prayed he would be caught. I also prayed that he would stop. I knew there was nothing I could say that would stop him.
Barbara never knew that her son, Michael, was spying for her ex-husband.
I couldn't tell her because I was afraid it would hurt her and that maybe she might try something like killing herself, my father, or just going off the deep end. I was really afraid for that.
In November 1984, Barbara's daughter Laura told her mother that when she was in the Army, her father had tried to enlist her as a spy. Outraged, Barbara finally worked up the courage to call the FBI, but they had a hard time believing her story.
Barbara told this fantastic story.
But one FBI agent, Joe Wolfinger, in Norfolk, Virginia, did believe her.
Apparently, Barbara Walker had accompanied him to Washington to fill a drop, clear a drop. She described that in a way in which I did not think a disgruntled, vindictive former wife would be able to describe an espionage transaction. She talked about seeing signals, leaving a drop at a particular place. It really had too much rich detail to be completely disregarded. So on that, those facts, we opened a case.
Wolfinger had no idea that the investigation would reveal a spy who many still believe to be the most damaging in American history. On February 25th, 1985, the FBI officially opened the case on John Walker. But to convict him, they would have to catch him in the act of making a drop to the Soviets. At this point, the FBI had never caught a spy in the act. The FBI tapped his phones at his home in Norfolk, Virginia, and his private investigation firm. They hoped for a clue, a hint of an upcoming delivery to the Soviets. In the meantime, they learned a bit about his personality from listening to his phone calls.
He would lie when the truth would serve him better. He was totally self-centered.
The FBI tapped Walker's phones for a month And finally, it paid off on May 16, 1985. They overheard a telephone call that sounded suspicious.
And it was his mother telling him that his favorite aunt had, as she said, cashed in her chips, meaning, of course, that she had died. And John's mom wanted him to come up to Pennsylvania and attend the funeral. And he begged off and said that he couldn't come. He had something to do that no one else could do. Well, as an investigator, that raises my antennae.
That weekend, Joe Wolfinger and FBI investigator Bob Hunter ordered surveillance teams and a helicopter to cover Walker's comings and goings. That Sunday, Walker came out, packed his van with a duffel bag, and backed out of his driveway. The FBI hoped this was the real thing and not a wild goose chase.
So now we're heading to D.C. It's getting very exciting at this point.
As they reached the state line, Wolfinger and Hunter turned it over to another FBI team, while they went to the FBI headquarters in D.C. to monitor the chase.
Wolfinger and I were in the command center about 20 minutes, I guess, when the words that you never want to hear on surveillance came piping through the radio. Anybody have the eyeball? We've lost them. So we agonized there in that command center for 4 hours. We didn't know where John was.
Finally, they picked up sight of Walker's Chevy Astro van again at 7:45 p.m.
Everything was wonderful. It was a wonderful day once again. And the spirits were high, and we were hard on the task immediately.
They followed Walker to an intersection in the backcountry roads of Maryland. The Soviets had prepared obsessively detailed maps for Walker, as well as photos of the signal and drop sites. Walker got out of his car at a stop sign and placed a 7-Up can under it and left. It was a signal to his KGB contact that he would make a drop later that night. Walker drove off, and the FBI continued its tight surveillance.
At about 8:30, he stopped under a tree, got out of his van, put something down on the ground, and we could see that.
After Walker left the scene, the FBI rushed in. Agents found a brown paper bag filled with bottles and junk, but buried under the garbage were reams of classified documents.
One of the agents came on the radio, and there was some excitement, and he said, I've got it, I can see it. It's got secret stuff in it. And at that point, we had an almost perfect espionage case against John Walker.
When the agents searched the bag, they found 129 classified documents from the USS Nimitz, where Michael Walker was assigned. They had the evidence. Now they needed the spy. They followed Walker back to the Ramada Inn in Rockville, Maryland, room 763. He was signed in under an assumed name, John A. Johnson. At 3:30 a.m., an FBI agent posing as a desk clerk called Walker in his room.
Mr. Johnson, you driving a Chevy Astro van, license so-and-so? Would you mind coming down to the desk? Someone just ran into it, and we need to, talk to the police, get the insurance, whatever. And of course, when he comes out, we're going to effect the arrest.
Bob Hunter and his partner were ready to nab him as he reached the elevator.
We knew that we had probably the biggest spy that there has ever been in this country. So the adrenaline is really flowing, and the heart is going, and we are ready.
Finally, they heard Walker's door open and close and saw him approach the elevator.
As he reaches for the elevator button with his left hand, he heard us move, and he wheeled around with his gun on us. We were close enough that I could see the bullets in the cylinder of his revolver, You know how you hear things are slow motion in some situations? Well, that's what this was. And I'm watching him with this pistol in his hand, and I can see those bullets. And it seemed like a long time before he finally did what we told him to, which of course was to drop the gun.
John Walker's days as the perfect spy were over, and he would suffer another humiliation as well.
As Colucci is searching him, he reached up and grabbed that toupee and pulled it off John's head, and it made this loud sucking noise, and he threw it on the floor, and I sort of laughed to myself. That was funny. In this period of high drama, that was funny.
In 1985, John Walker Jr. was sentenced to life imprisonment, as was his brother Arthur and his pal Jerry Whitworth. His son Michael received 25 years.
Evidence at trial and evidence before the grand jury, testimony by distinguished intelligence and military experts, they said that Walker's espionage gave the Russians war-winning capability.
Throughout his arrest and trial, Walker showed no remorse, excusing his actions by saying the Russians never could have won the war.
I sold secrets to a country that we were not at war with, and never have been at war with, and never will be at war with. That's all I'm saying. Don't make more of it than it is.
But the Soviets had given Walker's secret codes to the North Vietnamese, who were at war with the U.S.
I've always thought that John Walker is responsible for many of the widows that I knew in Virginia Beach who lost their husbands in Vietnam, who were Navy pilots.
He did some devastating things to this country. He put his comrades at risk and caused some of them to die. He has to live with that, but I don't have to like him.
Walker's arrest was a major victory for the FBI, but the year wasn't over yet. 2 more spies would be arrested in 1985, but they would be caught through information received from a surprising source, a Russian spy master who was a colonel in the KGB. Being felt